When police entered the Langston home on Ravenhill Drive, the water in the bathtub was still warm. Elaine Langston's body floated face down, her blonde hair spreading like silk across the surface. Beside the sink stood 4 prescription bottles, Valium, oxycodone, promethazine, Ambien, all labeled in her husband's handwriting. And in the doorway, calm as if he'd expected this moment, stood Dr. Victor Langston. He said it was an accident. He said she'd simply taken too much medication after surgery. But within days, his daughters would begin to uncover a secret so dark it would destroy everything they believed about love, faith, and family. 8 days earlier, life on Ravenhill Drive looked postcard perfect. The Langstons were the kind of family small towns like Ashford, North Carolina, loved to brag about. Victor Langston was a respected physician, a pillar of the church, a man who could make anyone feel small in his presence but never raise his voice to do it. His wife, Elaine, was a gentle balance to his intensity, devoted mother of 8, for biological and for adopted from Ukraine, a woman who kept the house immaculate and her heart open. To everyone outside, the Langstons were ideal. Inside, perfection was law. Victor's obsession with image ruled every detail. How his children dressed, how they spoke, how Elaine appeared beside him at Sunday service. He had started to criticize her softly at first. Little remarks about posture, skin, weight. Then sharper ones. You'd look younger if you tried. Elaine laughed them off until she couldn't anymore. The man who once promised her devotion now stared at her like a project in need of correction. He worked out obsessively, bought tighter suits, whitened his teeth, and talked endlessly about staying presentable. She tried to please him, new haircut, healthier meals, long walks, but nothing was ever enough. One night, over dinner, he said it plainly, "You should consider a facelift." Elaine blinked, unsure if he was joking. He wasn't. "I've already scheduled a consultation," he added, sliding a card across the table. Ambrose Surgical Center. Facial rejuvenation consultation. Her daughter Allison would later say that the look in her mother's eyes that night wasn't fear. It was defeat. Arguing with Victor meant hours of tension, days of silence. So Elaine smiled, nodded, and told him she'd think about it. The surgery was set for April 2nd, 2017. Elaine told Allison she didn't want it but couldn't refuse. "He insists it's for me," she whispered, "but it's really for him." On the morning of the procedure, she wore a pale blue scarf and sunglasses, clutching her Bible like a talisman. Before stepping into the clinic, she turned to her daughter. "If anything happens, don't let him control the story." Allison didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. Recovery began quietly. Victor became her caretaker, measuring doses, controlling every pill that entered her body. He told the children keep noise down, said their mother needed rest. When Allison called to check in, Elaine sounded sluggish, her voice faint. "He keeps giving me new pills," she said. "I don't even know what they're for." Allison offered to come home, but Victor told her not to. "Your mother's fine," he said. "Trust me. I'm a doctor." Neighbors saw him mowing the lawn, smiling, waving, acting normal. No one suspected anything unusual. But inside the house, Elaine's health was deteriorating. She could barely walk without feeling dizzy. Her speech slurred. She forgot things. At night, she told her youngest daughter she felt like she was slipping away. On April 10th, Allison called again. No answer. She left a message, her voice trembling. "Mom, please call me when you wake up. I'm worried." At 11:05 a.m., Victor Langston dialed 911. He told dispatchers his wife had stopped breathing. By the time paramedics arrived, she was gone. Elaine Langston's death was ruled an accident, an unfortunate reaction to medication after cosmetic surgery. Her husband's composure convinced nearly everyone. At the funeral, he thanked mourners for their prayers and quoted scripture about divine will. His eyes remained dry, but his daughters noticed everything he wanted them to ignore. The freshly scrubbed bathroom, the missing medication bottles, the indifference in his tone. 1 week after the funeral, Victor made an announcement. "I've hired someone to help around the house," he said. "Her name's Sabrina Cole. She'll look after the kids." The woman arrived the following morning. Dark hair, confident smile, moving easily through the kitchen that still smelled like Elaine's perfume. Within days, she was wearing Elaine's apron, sleeping in Elaine's bed, answering the home phone. Neighbors whispered, but Victor brushed it off. "My children need stability," he said. Behind those walls, the image of perfection crumbled. Allison couldn't sleep. Rebecca avoided coming home. Something about their father's new calm felt wrong. Too rehearsed, too measured, as if grief were just another performance. And as the sun set each evening over Ravenhill Drive, the Langston house looked peaceful again, its shutters closed, porch light glowing softly. While inside, the truth was quietly rearranging itself. Dr. Victor Langston wasn't mourning his wife. He was rewriting her story, step by calculated step. What nobody knew yet was that Elaine Langston's death wasn't the end of Langston's perfect image. It was the beginning of its collapse. The report said Elaine Langston died peacefully at home. But people who've seen what quiet death really looks like know peace doesn't smell like bleach. It doesn't leave the water running. And it doesn't make a husband stand perfectly still while strangers lift his wife's body from a tub that's still warm. When first responders entered the Langston home on Ravenhill Drive, the air was sharp with cleaning products. The mirrors fogged from steam. The floor was dry where it shouldn't have been. Elaine's body was submerged up to her shoulders, her skin pale, her eyes closed as if she'd simply drifted off. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Victor Langston, sleeves rolled, calm and composed. He said he'd found her that way. He said she'd mixed her medication wrong. He said it was an accident. The paramedics took notes, try and make sense of a scene that felt too neat. Victor spoke in full sentences, using medical terms as if reading from a report. He told them about the facelift, about her recovery, about the medication schedule. When they asked if he wanted to ride along to the hospital, he shook his head. "There's nothing more I can do," he said. By noon, the house was silent. The tub had been drained. The towels were gone. Only Victor remained, sitting in the living room, staring at nothing. By evening, the neighbors already knew. Dr. Langston's wife passed this morning. Someone said at the market. Tragic, after everything they've done for the community. People spoke kindly, brought casseroles, and sent cards. To the world outside, it was another heartbreak in a perfect family. Inside, it was something else. Allison Reed came home the next morning. She was in her final year of medical school, still wearing her hospital ID when she walked through the door. Her father hugged her briefly, then moved away as if nothing unusual had happened. The house smelled like disinfectant. Elaine's favorite flowers were gone. The bathroom door was closed. Victor had already arranged for a funeral. He said she'd had a bad reaction to painkillers. He said her heart had stopped. He said these things with a voice too steady to be real. The funeral came and went like a carefully staged performance. The service was short, the eulogy clinical. Victor's words sounded rehearsed, his grief timed to the rhythm of polite applause. Elaine was a woman of faith, he said. She's with God now. His eyes didn't water once. When he finished, he shook hands and smiled faintly, like a man thanking colleagues at conference. Afterward, Allison stayed behind in the pews, staring at the casket. She kept hearing her mother's voice from weeks before. If anything happens, don't let him control the story. That line echoed louder now than the organ music. Days passed, but Victor didn't slow down. He went back to work, saw patients, smiled for neighbors. He redecorated the bathroom, replacing the mirror, changing the curtains, even repainting the walls. When Allison asked why, he said, "It's therapeutic." He started jogging again, eating better, talking about the future. He seemed lighter, free even. Then, just 7 days after the funeral, he called a family meeting. The younger children sat on the couch, confused. Allison stood by the doorway, still in disbelief that this was happening. Victor announced that he'd hired help. "The children need structure," he said. "This is what's best for them." Her name was Sabrina Cole. She arrived that weekend, carrying a single suitcase and a confident smile. Dark hair, sharp features, eyes that didn't flinch when she met Victor's children. She moved through the house like someone stepping into a role she'd been preparing for her whole life. Within days, she had rearranged the kitchen, chosen new curtains, and taken over the household schedule. She wore Elaine's apron. She used Elaine's mug. She even hummed the same hymn Elaine used to sing while making breakfast. Allison watched in silence. She noticed how her father lingered near Sabrina, how they exchanged looks at dinner, how easily they slipped into routines that had once belonged to her parents. The neighbors noticed too. "It's good he's got help," someone said. "It's healthy to move on." No one questioned how quickly the nanny had arrived. No one thought to ask where she came from. Rebecca Langston couldn't sleep. She told Allison she heard footsteps at night, 2 sets instead of 1. The sound of laughter behind the master bedroom door. Their father dismissed it as imagination. "You girls are overthinking everything," he said. "Focus on your studies. The past is behind us." But the past wasn't behind them. It was buried beneath fresh paint, locked in side drawers, scrubbed out of photographs. Allison began noticing smaller things. The missing medication bottles, the duplicate prescriptions written days apart, the untouched glass of water on the nightstand in Elaine's old room. Every detail pointed to a story that didn't make sense. She started to write things down. Dates, times, conversations. A timeline of control. The surgery. The pills. The phone call that morning. Her father's exact words. "She wasn't breathing when I found her." The more she read her notes, the more deliberate it looked. In town, whispers started to spread. "Have you seen the new woman living there? Looks like the doctor's moving on." Guess grief hits everyone differently. But grief wasn't what they were seeing. It was transformation. The man who once obsessed over appearances had reinvented himself completely, and the woman now living in his house was part of that reinvention. One afternoon, Allison stopped by unannounced. She found Sabrina and Victor sitting close at the dining table, laughing. Her father looked up, startled but smiling. "You should smile more, Allie," he said. "It's a beautiful day." She glanced at the woman beside him, and saw it then. The wedding band on Sabrina's finger. It wasn't hers. It wasn't new. It was her mother's. Victor noticed her staring. "Don't look at me like that," he said softly. "Everything happens for a reason." That night, Allison sat alone in her car outside the house, notebook open. Tears she didn't feel sliding down her face. Something was terribly wrong. She didn't have proof yet, but she knew. Her mother hadn't died by accident. And whatever Victor Langston was hiding, the truth was buried in that bathroom, washed clean but not gone. On Ravenhill Drive, the house still looked perfect. Fresh paint, manicured lawn, lights glowing warmly in the windows. But perfection was only a disguise. Beneath it, something darker had begun to stir. The first time Allison Reed saw Sabrina Cole asleep in her mother's bed, she had to step out of the room just to breathe. The woman looked perfectly at home. Hair splayed across the pillow. One arm stretched over the duvet that still carried the faint scent of Elaine's perfume. The blinds were half drawn, letting thin ribbons of light fall across the dresser where Elaine used to keep her wedding ring. Now the ring was gone. Allison closed the door quietly. The house she'd grown up in no longer felt like hers. Every sound echoed wrong. Every photo on the wall looked like a lie. Victor moved the halls with newfound ease, humming, polishing his watch, greeting his children with a casual warmth that felt unnatural. He had begun hosting dinners again, small gatherings of church friends and colleagues, smiling for the first time in months. No one mentioned how Sabrina always sat beside him, pouring his wine, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm like she belonged there. Rebecca stopped coming home altogether. The younger children followed instructions automatically, their faces blank, their voices hushed. They called Sabrina Miss Cole at first, then just Sabrina. Within weeks, she was signing their school forms. Allison stayed silent, but she was documenting everything. Prescription lists, bank statements, even the new nanny's signature. She was building her own case, line by line, against her father. What she didn't expect was how deep the trail would go. One night, she stayed late after work, using her access to the hospital to pull her mother's full medical file. She scrolled through pages of data until she stopped on a familiar signature, Dr. Victor Langston. He had personally prescribed every sedative in her mother's toxicology report. Every refill came from his own pen. The final one was written just 2 days before Elaine's death, with increased dosage levels on each drug. It wasn't carelessness. It was precision. She drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel until her fingers went numb. Inside the house, the lights were low. Laughter drifted from the kitchen. Her father's voice, Sabrina's softer one, weaving through his. For the first time, Allison felt something beyond grief. It was fury. She walked into the kitchen without a word. Her father turned, surprised but calm. "You're home late," he said. "I found something," she replied. He tilted his head. "And what's that?" "You prescribed every drug that killed her." The room fell quiet. Sabrina froze. Victor's expression didn't change. He reached for his glass, took a slow sip, and set it down carefully. "Your mother was recovering from surgery. She was in pain. I followed standard protocol." "You increased every dosage," Allison said. "She couldn't have known what she was taking." He smiled faintly. "You've been reading things you don't understand." She stared at him. "You killed her." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Victor's voice dropped lower. "Be very careful, Allison. You're making dangerous accusations." He turned to Sabrina. "Go upstairs." She obeyed without hesitation. That night, Allison packed a bag and left the house. She moved in with Rebecca, and together they began the fight that would consume the next 2 years of their lives. They started by reaching out to anyone who would listen. Local detectives, the coroner's office journalists. Most dismissed them politely. "There's no evidence of foul play," one officer said. "Your mother's death was ruled accidental. You should move on." The sisters didn't. They pushed harder, filing requests, digging through public records, tracing their father's finances. That's when they found something that made everything worse. A bank statement from the month before Elaine's death showed multiple withdrawals to a name Allison didn't recognize, as Cole. It wasn't unusual for Victor to pay household staff, but the amounts were strange. Exact increments, timed around the same dates as the drug prescriptions. The last transfer came the morning Elaine died. It didn't make sense. Sabrina had supposedly met Victor after Elaine's death. So why was he paying her before? Allison's mind spiraled. Who was this woman? She barely existed online. No address, no work history, not even a driver's license under that name. Rebecca searched social media, public databases, anything, but came up empty. Sabrina Cole, the woman living in their home, was a ghost. One afternoon, while helping their younger sister with homework, Rebecca opened a family filing cabinet to grab an envelope. Stuck between 2 folders was an old manila file labeled adoption records. She pulled it out, curious. Inside were birth certificates for Ukrainian children, all neatly stamped and notarized. But one of them was wrong. The name had been erased and rewritten in black ink. Where their adopted sister's name should have been, it now read Sabrina Cole. Rebecca froze. She checked again. The date of birth matched their youngest adopted sibling, but the photograph was missing. She showed it to Allison that evening, her hands shaking. The realization hit like a lightning strike. The woman living in their house wasn't just their father's mistress. She was using one of their adopted sister's stolen identities. The next morning, Allison walked straight into the Ashford Police Department and handed the folder to the desk sergeant. "My father's wife was murdered," she said, "and this woman is part of it." The officer looked skeptical, but took the papers. Within weeks, a detective named Warren Keller reopened file. He'd handled enough quiet towns to know that the most respectable faces often hid the darkest stories. Toxicology reports were re-examined. Elaine's autopsy, originally ruled accidental, was reviewed again by a state pathologist. The findings were clear. The combination of sedatives found in her bloodstream wasn't random. It was calculated, mixed at the exact ratios known to depress heart rate and induce unconsciousness before drowning. Her death wasn't peaceful. It was staged. As the investigation deepened, the truth started to ripple through Ashford. The perfect doctor, the devoted husband, the grieving widower, the town's golden family. None of it was real. Beneath the surface, it was all constructed. When police questioned Sabrina Cole, She didn't deny her relationship with Victor. She admitted she'd moved in shortly after Lane's death, but when asked about her past, she hesitated. Her answers contradicted one another. When investigators confronted her with the forged birth certificate, her expression faltered. "He told me it would make things easier," she whispered. "He said it was temporary." Allison sat across from Detective Keller when the report came back. She didn't cry. She just nodded, as if she'd known all along. Her father had killed her mother, replaced her with another woman, and thought he'd buried the truth forever. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, just like bodies in water. By the end of that summer, the case that began with a warm bathtub and a flawless lie was turning into something far bigger. The perfect man of Ravenhill Drive was about to be exposed for what he truly was. The first real crack in Victor Langston's mask appeared the day police knocked on his office door. His staff watched him from behind glass walls, their voices fading to whispers as Detective Warren Keller and his partner led him out in quiet conversation. He didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. He adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his coat, and walked with them as though he had an appointment he'd been expecting all along. The charges weren't murder. Not yet. The first were smaller, technical, falsifying prescriptions, misusing controlled substances, tampering with records. But everyone knew where it was headed. When the news broke in Ashford, disbelief turned to fascination. For years, people had looked at Victor and seen a man of authority, intellect, faith. Now, they saw something else entirely. Someone capable of orchestrating death and convincing the world it was mercy. Allison Reed sat in the front row of the arraignment. She'd waited almost 2 years for this. When Victor entered the courtroom in handcuffs, her heart stopped. He looked older, thinner, but still eerily composed. The kind of calm that doesn't belong to the innocent. He scanned the crowd, saw her, and smiled faintly before taking his seat. The gesture chilled her more than anything he'd ever said. Detective Keller's team worked through every inch of the case. The timeline, the prescriptions, the fake identity, the financial trail. Piece by piece, it fit together with precision that didn't feel human. Victor had written every dosage himself, filled them under his own authority, and timed each refill with surgical control. Then, just before Elaine's death, he'd transferred funds to Sabrina Cole under a false name, payments that matched the pharmacy receipts almost to the dollar. The story was clear. Victor had turned medicine into murder. Sabrina's interrogation changed everything. For weeks, she had stayed loyal, insisting she'd done nothing wrong. But the forged documents, the adoption files, the signature mismatched across state forms, trapped her in a lie she couldn't explain. When confronted with the evidence, she broke. Her voice trembled as she admitted the truth. He had met her long before Elaine's death. She wasn't a nanny, and she wasn't new to Ashford. She'd been working in another town under a different alias when Victor found her. Someone lonely, someone looking for direction. He promised her a better life, a home, a future. She said he was magnetic, controlling, impossible to refuse. He told her Elaine's health was failing, that it was merciful to let her go peacefully. He called it kindness. Sabrina said she never saw the body. She only knew that the night before Elaine died, Victor told her, by tomorrow, everything will be different. And it was. When the confession reached the press, Ashford turned on him overnight. His clinic shut down. His medical license was revoked. His church board quietly erased his name from its roster. Neighbors who once brought him casseroles now crossed the street to avoid him. The man who had spent his life curating perfection was finally being seen for what he was. A fraud, a manipulator, a killer dressed as a savior. Still, Victor denied everything. He called the accusation slander. He said Sabrina was unstable, the daughters ungrateful, the police incompetent. He insisted Elaine's death was accidental, that her daughters were twisting grief into vengeance. He smiled in interviews. He quoted scripture. He said, "The truth will set me free." But it didn't. The prosecution was meticulous. They built their case like surgeons, slow, precise, and devastating. Every refill slip, every bank transfer, every phone call was mapped to a timeline that showed intent. Toxicologists testified that the mixture of sedatives in Elaine's system could only have been administered by someone with medical training. The state medical examiner, Dr. Samuel Greer, changed the official cause of death from accidental to undetermined due to combined drug toxicity. In court, that phrase landed like a hammer. When the indictment for murder finally came, the courtroom filled beyond capacity. Journalists lined the aisles. Old friends from church sat with folded arms, watching the man they'd once called their brother in faith. Victor's expression didn't waver. Even as the charges were read, first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, fraud, he looked straight ahead, his hands folded neatly on the table. The same composure he'd held the morning his wife was found dead. Allison and Rebecca watched in silence. It wasn't satisfaction they felt, just exhaustion. Years of carrying the truth alone had hollowed them out. Their father had stolen their mother's life, then almost stolen reality itself. To see him finally unmasked and bring peace, it brought a kind of numb relief. When the hearing ended, Victor was led back toward the holding cell. As he passed his daughters, he turned slightly and whispered, just loud enough for them to hear, "You think you've won?" His voice was calm. "You don't understand what you wanted." That night, Allison replayed the words over and over. What she wanted. It sounded like a clue or a taunt, or both. She wondered if there were still parts of the story buried under all the evidence. If Victor had manipulated even that final moment to look like consent, she would never know. Some truths die with the people who create them. In the months that followed, the Langston name disappeared from Ashford's polite conversations. The house on Ravenhill Drive sat empty, its windows shuttered, its garden overgrown. Children whispered stories about it, about lights flickering in the upstairs bathroom, about the sound of water running even when the taps were off. The neighbors didn't correct them. They didn't want to remember. For Allison and Rebecca, forgetting wasn't an option. Every memory carried a question that could never be answered. Why didn't anyone believe them sooner? How many signs had they missed? How long had their mother known? The trial date was set for spring. Victor's defense team promised to expose a conspiracy of grief and resentment. The prosecution prepared their witnesses, and the sisters prepared to face the man who had taught them that love could sound like control and trust could look like murder. The perfect crime Victor Langston thought he'd written was about to be rewritten, line by line, by the people he had underestimated the most. Spring arrived in Ashford like nothing had happened. Dogwoods bloomed along the courthouse lawn, their petals scattering across the steps where reporters stood waiting for the doors to open. The trial of Dr. Victor Langston was the biggest story the town had ever seen. For weeks, headlines framed it as the unmasking of a man who had lived two lives. One as a doctor, a father, a man of faith, the other as a manipulator who killed for control. Inside the courtroom, the air was tight with heat and tension. Every seat was taken. At the prosecution's table, the stacks of evidence rose like walls. Medical charts, prescription records, financial statements, and a photograph of Elaine Langston that had become the symbol of the case. Smiling softly, unaware that her husband was planning her death. Across the room, Victor sat motionless, his posture straight, his eyes blank. He looked less like a man on trial, and more like a man watching someone else's story unfold. The prosecutor began with the simplest question. Why would a man of medicine, a husband of 30 years, deliberately kill his wife? Then came the answer, piece by piece, over 6 relentless weeks. Witnesses took the stand, neighbors, nurses, pharmacists, and finally, Sabrina Cole. Each added another thread to a web that was impossible to untangle. Sabrina's testimony changed everything. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she didn't look away from Victor. She told the court how he had drawn her in, how he promised her a life together if she helped him end his wife's suffering. He said Elaine was sick, that the medication was mercy, that the world would thank him later. Sabrina admitted she hadn't believed him, not fully, but she had wanted to. He made you feel like he was the only truth in the room, she said. He didn't ask for help. He commanded it. When the defense cross-examined her, they tried to tear her apart. You were in love with him, weren't you? The attorney asked. You wanted his wife gone. Sabrina hesitated, then nodded slightly. I wanted the version of him he promised me, she said. But that version never existed. Allison Reed was called next. The courtroom went silent as she walked to the stand. Her hands were steady, but her voice carried a tremor only she could hear. She told him everything: her mother's last phone call, the prescription trail, the threats, the moment she realized the truth. He killed her because she stopped being perfect, she said. He wanted control more than love. And when she wouldn't fit his image anymore, he replaced her. Victor didn't look at her while she spoke. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tightening only once, when she said the word murder. The prosecution's case built itself. The mixture of sedatives in Elaine's bloodstream matched the exact prescription sequence Victor had ordered. The timeline of withdrawals from his account aligned with Sabrina's own testimony. The forged identity, the insurance claims, the bleach-stained bathroom, it all formed a pattern that no coincidence could explain. The prosecutor called it murder by manipulation, a slow, calculated act hidden behind the authority of a white coat. When the defense finally presented its argument, it was thin and desperate. They painted Victor as a grieving husband framed by a bitter daughter and a jealous mistress. They claimed Elaine's death was a tragic accident made worse by speculation. But the jury had already seen too much. Every lie he'd told was now evidence. Every expression of calm was now suspicion. Every word he spoke sounded rehearsed. The verdict came just after midnight on the 23rd day of deliberation. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with whispers. Victor stood as the clerk read the decision. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty of fraud and prescription tampering. He didn't flinch. He simply straightened his collar and smiled, a faint, eerie curve that froze everyone in the room. As deputies led him away, he turned his head slightly toward his daughters and mouthed something no one could hear. Outside, flashes from cameras lit up the night. Reporters shouted questions. Neighbors wept. For the first time in years, Ravenhill Drive was quiet. The man who had once been its pride was now its ghost. In the days that followed, Allison tried to process what victory felt like. The truth was, it didn't feel like victory at all. The sentence, life without parole, brought no satisfaction, only silence. The house still stood. The memories still lingered. The gap left by her mother's absence was as wide as ever. The trial had proven what she always knew, but knowing didn't heal anything. Rebecca refused to attend the sentencing. She said she couldn't bear to see him again. Instead, she visited the cemetery. The wind was cold that morning and the sky hung low. She placed fresh lilies on her mother's grave and whispered, "He can't hurt anyone anymore." But deep down, she wasn't sure that was true, because people like Victor Langston don't stop haunting you once they're gone. They live on in doubt, in the second-guessing, the sleepless nights, the what-ifs. As the media frenzy faded, Ashford moved on. The Langston story became a cautionary tale, a topic for podcasts and documentaries. Locals spoke of it in lowered voices. "He was such a good man," they'd say, shaking their heads. You just never know what goes on inside someone's home. But Allison and Rebecca knew. They'd seen the face of evil up close. And it didn't look like a monster. It looked like a man who smiled while the world applauded him. A man who'd spent a lifetime convincing everyone he was good. Until the mask cracked and the truth stared back. When the verdict was final, Allison stood outside the courthouse, the sun rising behind her. Reporters shouted her name, asking how it felt. She said only, "We didn't win. We just stopped losing." The cameras caught her words, but not her expression. The quiet realization that justice had limits. It could punish a killer, but it couldn't bring back the warmth that used to fill her home. It couldn't erase the image of her mother's hand slipping beneath the surface of bathwater that was still warm. The world called it justice. But to the Langston daughters, it would always be the price of surviving him. When the sentence was handed down, the courtroom emptied slowly. Chairs scraped the floor, murmurs echoed, and people filed out past a man who'd once been the pride of Ashford. Dr. Victor Langston sat motionless as the bailiff read the final words. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the end of the trial, but not the end of the story. He was taken from the courthouse in silence, head high, face expressionless. The cameras outside captured every step, as though they were filming the conclusion of a play. Reporters shouted his name, but he never looked up. Later, one of the guards would say that even in handcuffs, he seemed unbroken, like he believed he'd still find a way to win. Weeks passed, and the noise faded. The reporters left. The courthouse returned to its usual quiet. The people of Ashford moved on, but the Langston family couldn't. They were left with what remained: the house on Ravenhill Drive, the memories that haunted it, and the shadow of the man who had built it. Victor's house sat untouched. No one had the heart to sell it. The curtains stayed drawn, the mailbox empty. Weeds crept across the lawn where Elaine used to plant lilies. At night, porch lights from neighboring homes stopped just short of its fence line. People said they could still see movement inside, faint silhouettes passing by the upstairs window, the one that looked over the bathroom where she died. Others said they heard the sound of water running when the wind picked up. Allison Reed drove by once, late in the summer after the verdict. She parked at the edge of the street and watched from behind the wheel. The house looked smaller than she remembered, but heavier, as if it carried its own gravity. The front door was locked, but she could still picture the last time she'd walked through it. The clean smell of bleach, the way her father had smiled at her as if daring her to question him. She sat there for a long time before turning the engine off and stepping out. The grass crunched under her shoes. The air was thick with the smell of rain and soil. She walked up the front steps and looked through the window. Dust had gathered on everything, but the order remained. Books still aligned by color on the shelf. The family photo still hung above the fireplace. Her father's perfection had survived even his absence. It was as though he'd built the house not to live in, but to outlast everyone who'd ever challenged him. When she finally walked away, she didn't look back. Victor Langston was transferred to a state penitentiary 2 hours north of Ashford. Inmates called him the doctor. He kept to himself, reading, writing letters that were never sent. On paper, he was a model prisoner, but his silence made people uneasy. When questioned by psychologists, he spoke calmly about destiny, order, and the nature of control. "The world needs structure," he said once. "Even chaos obeys rules." They marked him as detached, narcissistic, stable. 3 years into his sentence, a guard found him one morning lying on the floor of his cell, motionless. The cause of death was suicide. The note he left behind was short: "Perfection is peace." News of his death barely made a ripple. By then, Ashford had another scandal, another name to whisper about. The Langston story had become a cautionary tale told to new residents. How a doctor's brilliance had curdled into arrogance. How love had been replaced by possession. How a house on Ravenhill Drive had turned from a symbol of success into a shrine to deceit. The locals still avoided walking past it after dark. The ones who did claimed to feel something watching from the upstairs window. For Allison and Rebecca, life moved on in fragments. Rebecca married, moved out of state, and rarely spoke about Ashford. Allison stayed close, finishing her medical residency in Charlotte. She said she wanted to do what her father never did: heal without hurting. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's face, gentle, trusting, unaware of what was coming. Guilt was a kind of inheritance she couldn't escape. One year, on the anniversary of Elaine's death, Allison drove back to town. The morning was overcast, the streets nearly empty. She stopped at the cemetery with a bouquet of lilies and placed them by her mother's grave. She stayed there for hours, talking softly, her words swallowed by the wind. "I thought justice would feel different," she said. "I thought when he was gone, I'd stop hearing him." She paused, tracing her fingers over her mother's name. "But he's still here, just quieter." She looked up at the sky, gray and endless. "You told me not to let him control the story," she whispered. "I didn't. I finished it." That evening, as she left town, she drove past Ravenhill Drive one last time. The sun had started to set, turning the sky a dull red. For a second, she thought she saw someone standing in the upstairs window, just a flicker, a shape against the fading light. When she blinked, it was gone. Maybe it was her reflection. Maybe it was memory. The house remained, empty, silent, watching. In Ashford, people still tell the story. about the brilliant doctor who loved order more than people, who turned his wife's fear into a prescription, who buried his guilt beneath the illusion of perfection. They tell it as a warning, about appearances, about trust, about the kind of evil that hides behind education and charm. And every year, when the dogwoods bloom white against the cracked fence of Ravenhill Drive, someone leaves a single lily at the front steps. No one claims to know who. Some say it's Allison. Some say it's the wind. But everyone agrees on one thing. Perfection killed Elaine Langston. And on Ravenhill Drive, perfection still lingers, quiet, polished, and waiting